My name is Marjorie Ellison, and I have lived in Springfield, Missouri nearly all my life, for the last 12 years. Since my husband Walter passed from a sudden heart attack, Christmas has been my responsibility. It was always our season. He carved the nativity by hand. I baked the pies, and together we filled the house with warmth after he was gone. I clung to those traditions as if they were a lifeline, telling myself that if I kept them alive, a part of him would stay alive too. Every December I haul the boxes down from the closet, polish the old ornaments, and press the tablecloth. Walter and I bought our first year of marriage. The kitchen becomes a whirlwind of butter, sugar, and flour, while the smell of a ham roasting carries through the hall. I want the house to feel the way it used to, the way he would have wanted it. My daughter Caroline helps me carry that hope. She drives in from 2 hours away with her husband and children, arms full of casseroles and laughter, always steady, always dependable. When she walks through the door, I breathe easier, reminded that not all traditions have to hurt. But then there is my son, Grant, and his wife, Belinda, for years. Their arrival has meant raised voices, sharp remarks, and tension that sits heavy on the table like a storm cloud. What should be a day of joy has become something I brace myself for, a test of endurance rather than a celebration. I light the candles, set the silverware, and tell myself that maybe this year will be different. But deep down, I know the pattern too well, and the first cracks began long before last Christmas. It was the first Christmas after Walter's death that the atmosphere shifted, though I didn't recognize it at the time. I had spent weeks planning, clipping coupons, and stretching my Social Security check to make sure every grandchild had something special. Caroline's 2 children each had a wrapped stack on one side of the tree, and Grant's little ones had the same on the other. I thought I had balanced it carefully, making lists and checking them twice like Santa himself. Belinda was the first to notice, or rather, to accuse. She picked up one of Caroline's daughter's gifts, turned it over in her hands, and said loud enough for the room to fall silent, "Looks like someone's playing favorites. These look a whole lot nicer than what my kids got." Her voice cut sharper than the carving knife in my kitchen drawer. I felt my cheeks burn as the children's eyes darted between us. Carolyn shifted uncomfortably, trying to redirect the moment. But Grant stepped in with a nod toward his wife. "She's right. Mom, you've always done more for Carolyn's kids. You think we don't notice, but we do." My throat closed as I tried to speak. I wanted to tell them how I had spent hours comparing prices, how I'd counted out bills at the register and left groceries behind so there'd be enough for the gifts. Instead, I sat in silence, my palms pressed together, staring at the unopened boxes beneath the tree. The children froze, their excitement replaced with confusion. None of them tore at the wrapping paper. The joy I had worked so hard to preserve drained out of the room, replaced by something cold and heavy. That was the night I first wondered if Christmas would ever feel the same again. And the years that followed proved the doubt wasn't misplaced. The next year I tried harder. I told myself the last Christmas had been an aberration, that grief made tempers short and words sharp. I scrubbed the house until it smelled of lemon polish, roasted the ham to perfection, and baked pies until my hands ached. Caroline arrived early, as she always did, slipping into the kitchen with her gentle smile and a casserole dish still warm from her oven. We laughed together as we laid out the food, hoping the laughter might carry us through. By the time everything was ready, Grant and Belinda were still nowhere to be seen. The clock ticked, the rolls cooled, and the children fidgeted in their seats when the front door finally creaked open. Nearly 2 hours had passed. They walked in without apology, coats still draped over their arms, and sat down as though the delay didn't matter. We bowed our heads for grace, But before long, the meal turned sour. Grant leaned back in his chair, his fork clattering against the plate, and said, "Mom, we need your help. Things are tight, and we just need a little boost. A few thousand will cover it." The table went silent. I looked at him, my heart pounding, and shook my head gently. "I can't. Grant. I live on a fixed income. There isn't money like that to give." Belinda muttered something under her breath, the word stingy slipping through like poison. Grant's face turned red. He pushed his chair back so hard it scraped the floor. "You'd rather spend on Caroline than help your own son," he shouted, before storming toward the door. The slam echoed through the house, shaking the wreath from its hook and sending it tumbling to the floor. The children cried softly, and Christmas ended there, long before dessert could be served. It was then I realized the fractures in our family were deepening, and the following year would only bring them closer to breaking wide open. By the third year, I thought I had learned from my mistakes. I wanted to show Grant and Belinda that I was trying, that I cared. I spent days preparing, pulling down Walter's old recipe cards and following them to the letter. The ham was basted carefully every half hour. The green bean casserole was assembled with fresh beans instead of canned, and the pies this time were made entirely from scratch. My hands trembled as I crimped the edges of the crust, but I told myself it would be worth it if it eased the tension. Caroline arrived early as usual, offering her steady presence in the kitchen. She noticed the flour on my apron and smiled. "Homemade pies this year?" she asked. I nodded, feeling a spark of pride I hadn't felt in a long time. But when Belinda walked in, she barely looked around before wrinkling her nose. "That ham looks awfully dry," she said, not even sitting down. She pointed at the casserole and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "That's too heavy. The kids shouldn't eat much of it." Then she leaned closer to the pie, cooling on the counter, and smirked. "Store-bought again, I would have baked mine." My heart sank as I answered softly, "I did bake it, Belinda, from scratch," but she had already turned away, calling her children to sit. Dinner never found its rhythm. Belinda made small cutting remarks between bites, and Grant said little, though his silence carried its own approval. By the time dessert was served, Belinda stood, gathering her children with a huff. "Come on, let's go," she said, not even glancing back. The door shut behind them, leaving the house strangely quiet. I stood in the kitchen surrounded by dirty dishes, the pie untouched on the counter, and wondered why I kept putting myself through it. That night, as I washed plates alone, I felt the first real weight of despair, a heaviness that told me the worst was still ahead. By the fourth year, I told myself I was ready for anything. I had learned to bite my tongue, to let Belinda's words pass through me like wind through an empty room. I thought if I could just stay quiet, if I could just endure, maybe the storm would pass. I polished Walter's old silver, laid out the best china, and tried to convince myself that dignity would hold the family together when love no longer seemed enough. Caroline arrived with her usual calm, her children carrying dishes in their small hands. The laughter they brought felt fragile, like glass I didn't dare set down too hard. Then Grant and Belinda arrived late again, stepping into the room as though they owned it. Voices raised from some argument they hadn't bothered to finish in the car. We sat, plates full, and I tried to say, "Grace." But the moment I lowered my head, Belinda sighed loudly. "Same meal, every year," she muttered. The words stung. But before I could respond, Grant shoved his chair closer to the table, his eyes narrowing. "You always take her side," he spat, his voice rising. His fist came down hard on the wood, and the plates rattled, silverware clattering like startled birds. The children froze. Forks halfway to their mouths, eyes wide with fear. Caroline tried to speak, her voice trembling. "Grant, that's not fair." He cut her off. Turning back to me, his face red. "You've never been on my side. Not once. Everything is always about Caroline. Her kids. Her life. You've never cared about mine." The words struck deep. Not because they were true, but because they carried the weight of a son I no longer recognized. My hands trembled in my lap, and something inside me cracked. I wanted to stand, to shout, to tell him he was wrong. But my voice caught in my throat, so I stayed silent. The anger burned in my chest, heavy and sharp, but I swallowed it down, convincing myself it was the only way to keep the peace. Yet, as the table settled back into uneasy quiet, I knew a line had been crossed, and the cost of my silence was growing heavier than I could bear. By the 5th year, the weight of it all was starting to show in ways I couldn't hide. At my yearly checkup, the doctor pressed the stethoscope against my chest, frowned at the numbers on the monitor, and told me plainly that my blood pressure was too high. "Mrs. Ellison, you have to cut down on stress," he said, his voice steady but firm. "If you keep pushing yourself like this, you're putting your health at risk." I nodded, promising I'd take it seriously. But as December drew closer, the same heaviness pressed on my chest. I still pulled down the boxes from the closet, still polished the nativity Walter carved, still ironed the tablecloth we'd bought in our first years of marriage. My hands did the work, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. One cold afternoon, Doris stopped by with her cranberry salad recipe tucked under her arm. She noticed the slump in my shoulders and the quiet in my voice. "You look worn down, Marjorie," she said, her hand resting on mine. "You don't have to keep sacrificing your peace for tradition. You've raised your children. You've done your part. If they bring chaos, let them do it somewhere else." Her words lingered long after she left. Part of me wanted to believe her, but another part clung to the thought of my grandchildren, their faces lighting up under the tree. That image always pulled me back, even when I knew it came with shouting and slammed doors. Then came the phone calls and messages. Grant rang one evening, his tone casual as if nothing had happened the year before. "Mom, the kids really want those new gaming systems. They're on sale now. It would mean a lot." My throat tightened. "Grant, I can't afford that. I live on Social Security. I've already bought gifts books, puzzles, sweaters." He sighed, heavy with disappointment. "You always do this. You make it easy for Caroline's kids. But mine go without." The next morning, Belinda's text arrived. A list of demands: turkey instead of ham, macaroni and cheese instead of green beans, no cranberry sauce. She ended it with, "The kids won't eat otherwise." I set the phone down, refusing to reply. But even as I stood firm, guilt wrapped itself around me, leaving me wondering how much of myself I could give before there was nothing left at all. On Christmas Eve of the 6th year, I woke before dawn, the house already feeling heavy with expectation. I moved through the familiar motions, polishing silver, checking the ham in the oven, arranging pies on the counter, but the weight of Doris's words and the doctor's warning pressed in on me. I told myself this would be the last time I hosted if things went wrong. It was my line in the sand, though no one else knew it. Caroline arrived early, as she always did. She brought sweet potatoes and her steady warmth, slipping into the kitchen to stir sauces and pour drinks. Her presence kept my hands from shaking as I set the good china on the table. We moved quietly together, as if speaking too loudly might summon the storm before it began. By 6 o'clock, the rolls had cooled, and the children were fidgeting. Caroline glanced at the clock, then at me, her lips pressed tight. At 1:30. The door swung open. Grant and Belinda entered mid-argument, coats half off, voices raised as if they'd brought the fight in with them. The grandchildren trailed behind, their eyes fixed on the floor. We tried to carry on. I passed the potatoes. Carolyn poured drinks. The children shifted in their chairs. But Belinda wrinkled her nose at the ham. "Didn't I say the kids don't eat this? You could have made something normal." She tapped her fork against the casserole dish. "And green beans again. Nobody touches that." My chest tightened. But before I could answer, Grant leaned forward, his face flushed. "See? This is exactly it. You never listen. You always do things your way, Mom. And you always side with Caroline. You've never cared about me or my kids." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. The children froze, forks suspended, eyes wide. Caroline opened her mouth to speak, but I didn't let her. Something inside me broke loose. My hand slammed down on the table so hard the plates rattled, silverware clattering like a bell. "Enough," I said, my voice sharp and steady. "Get out of my house. Both of you." The silence that followed was deafening. Belinda's mouth fell open. Grant's face turned red, and then they rose, grabbed their coats, and stormed out. The door slammed so hard the wreath shook against the glass. I sat slowly, my palms flat on the table, the children staring at me in stunned silence. The house was still, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator, and in that stillness I knew something had ended for good, though what would come next remained uncertain. That night, after the house emptied and the dishes sat untouched on the table, I walked from room to room, letting the silence settle into my bones. The tree still glowed in the corner, ornaments catching the light. But it all felt staged, like a set for a play no one wanted to watch. I looked at the mantel where Walter's nativity stood, the donkey with its uneven legs, the baby Jesus carved with tender care, and I whispered aloud, "Christmas is canceled. I'm selling this house." The words startled me at first, but as soon as I spoke them, a calm settled over me. I went to the desk, turned on the computer, and typed realtors near me. My fingers didn't tremble when I filled out the online form. By the time I shut the screen, the decision was no longer a threat I hurled into the empty air. It was a choice, and it was mine. The next morning at 9 sharp, a young agent arrived with a clipboard and a polite smile. We walked through each room together, her questions practical and precise. When she pushed the for sale sign into the frozen ground of my front yard, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. The house that had held both laughter and shouting was no longer mine to protect or endure. Within hours, my phone lit up. Grant sent one text after another. "You embarrassed us. You ruined Christmas. Don't expect us back next year." The last one read, "You'll regret this." I didn't answer. Then Belinda's posts appeared on Facebook, cryptic lines about a grandmother who cared more about appearances than family. Strangers commented, siding with her. And for a moment, my stomach churned, but I closed the app and set the phone aside. I had already given enough of my life to their drama. That afternoon, Caroline pulled into the driveway. When she saw the sign in the yard, she froze, her mouth slightly open. "Mom," she said softly, "what have you done?" I looked at her, steady and calm, what I should have done years ago. Her eyes searched mine, shock giving way to something quieter, something that looked like understanding. And as the wind rattled the sign outside, I knew the next step was to begin packing. The days that followed moved in a blur of cardboard and tape. Each box I packed carried more than belongings. It carried the weight of memory. Walter's tools from the garage, worn smooth from years of his hands, went into one box. The quilts I had stitched through winters long past were folded carefully into another. When I reached the nativity set, I paused. Each figure carved by Walter seemed to hold its own heartbeat. I wrapped them one by one in tissue, whispering that they would come with me, that peace would follow wherever I went. Caroline came often, her voice steady, her presence a balm. She held the tape dispenser when my hands grew tired and didn't argue when I said the house was no longer home. Her children, confused at first, asked why Grandma's house had a sign in the yard. I knelt and told them gently that a house was just walls, that family lived in the laughter and love we carried with us. They nodded slowly, and I hoped they believed me. When the last box was loaded onto the truck, I stood for a long moment in the empty living room. The echoes of arguments seemed to fade with each breath until only silence remained. I locked the door one final time and slipped the key into the realtor's envelope. My new apartment was small, 2 bedrooms on the other side of Springfield. But it was manageable, light-filled, and mine. I joined the quilting circle again, started walking at the park on Saturdays, and signed up to volunteer at the senior center. My days filled with quiet purpose, my nights with rest rather than dread. And when December came, I wondered if joy could grow again without the old walls holding me back. That December, my apartment glowed softly with the light of a small tree tucked into the corner. It was nothing like the grand displays I had once forced into the old house, but it was enough. Caroline arrived with her family. Doris followed with her cranberry salad, and we filled the rooms with warmth that had nothing to do with size. The table was set simply roast chicken, potatoes, rolls, and pie, but every dish was passed with laughter instead of tension. The children played a board game in the living room, while Doris hummed along to the carols playing quietly from the radio. Caroline leaned against the counter, smiling at me in a way that told me she understood. This was the Christmas we had both been waiting for. There were no accusations, no slammed doors, no sharp words to cut through the evening, only the gentle murmur of voices, the clink of dishes, and the sound of joy filling a space that finally felt like home. As I sat back, watching the candles flicker, I realized the truth I had resisted for so long. Traditions only matter if they bring joy. If they bring pain, they aren't worth keeping. If peace costs tradition, would you pay the price?